Okay, thanks again for everyone being here. I'll just start by saying that you're not going to find too much here that isn't pretty routine, at least in terms of what we've been doing for a number of years. This was really developed as much as anything for the numerous first and second year MSs and PMs that we have throughout the company. That's one reason why it will be recorded and uploaded to Grace Hill, so that anyone who was not able to participate but is new to this process will be able to go to that very soon and get the same information. So we'll just get started here. Because this is directed to people that are kind of new to the position, one thing that I want to point out is that the process of creating and following through on a bid package actually lasts all year long. You're working a year, sometimes several years in advance, but what you want to do is keep a running list of the items that you believe may need some sort of attention in the year or years to come. Things that will be a little bit more obscure than the things that are easy to think about. As the screen says, the bigger items like asphalt repair, re-roofing work, etc., those are easy to remember when it comes time to, your RPM comes to you and says, let's get your wish list for your budget, the things that you'd like to do, the things that you think are critical, and let's get those together and start talking about them. So if you haven't kept track of what those might be as you become aware of them, and you've got to try and consider everything all at once and under a little bit of pressure, things may be overlooked. Some of the examples that I've considered, one is replacement of shutoff valves. This again is not something that you think of every day necessarily, but if routinely you're having trouble with your valves shutting the apartment completely down, or maybe it's a branch valve that you occasionally need, but it doesn't work when you need it. That's an example of something that you might try to put together a replacement program in a proactive form. And in fact, many communities are doing that already. I know Ashton Point, for example, does, and we've got a property in Lexington that has made that a project. So shutoff valve replacement, flue pipe replacement. We've been in a number of communities lately where we've noticed an inordinate amount of problems with the flue pipe, and it may require a special project to get these things done, as opposed to just repairing them as you become aware of them. So flue pipe replacement, gas line repair, those are all examples. Got one other example, dumpster pad repositioning. That may be something a number of communities have trouble with the way that their dumpsters sit. They're in enclosures that were made for a different kind of container. Now things have changed, the truck has changed, and it doesn't work now. Well, if you think about that and work that into a budget when the time comes, then you can really do a good thing for the community in terms of curb appeal and efficiency of picking up your trash. So those are all things that you might have on this theoretical wish list that is beyond just the normal things that we know about: tuck pointing, asphalt repair, concrete repair, and the numerous other things that are pretty routine for just about every community. So once you've determined the need, you'll want to start gathering estimates. There are numerous resources to assist in doing this, and obviously sister communities are probably the first thing that you might consider. We are blessed with the fact that we've got a lot of communities that were built in the same era with the same type of architecture, same type of equipment, and so there's a lot of common knowledge between all of our properties that we should be readily sharing with one another when it comes time to figuring out how much things cost and how much should I budget. Of course, one of the most common ways to come up with cost estimates is to ask a contractor. And the only thing that I would ask in this case is if you are asking for a cost estimate from a contractor, make sure that they realize right up front that that's what you're doing. Oftentimes we've had arrangements like this where a contractor believed that he or she was actually bidding on a project and was not aware that he was actually just providing some base data to a maintenance supervisor who was then going to use it for a budget and in turn getting bids from probably that person, but not necessarily, but always in addition to 2 or 3 other people. So that original contractor may very well be providing you a service that eventually benefits another subcontractor. Oftentimes they're okay with this because we're established enough with them that they know that's part of the game and they're willing to do that. But they should be aware up front when that's the case. And of course, us, the maintenance operations managers, we are always willing to look into things for you. We know what other properties have done. We can often give you a real good idea of what something would cost for any given property or any given project that you might have. Okay, every bid package then, when you've got to the point where you're actually going to solicit bids, every bid package created for the contracting of service, and I make a point of saying as opposed to the purchase of materials, and I do that because more and more we are getting in the practice in some areas in particular, in some properties, of providing the materials for some of the bigger ticket items. And that's okay. That comes with a certain responsibility, and as long as you're willing to take on that responsibility, it could possibly save you some money. One example that I can give you is a property in Fort Wayne that has been in the middle of a 3 or 4 year fence replacement program, and any of you that are out there who have bid fence replacement, I would guess that virtually every time it's been a labor and material bid. But in this case, they actually got bids from a number of lumber yards and resources for the material that was going into the job. And the only thing that they got, and then the second set of bids that they got was for the labor only. And I would say that they may have saved 10 or 15% in the process. Now, of course, the flip side of that is it gives you one additional package to complete, follow through on, get approval on, and get back into your hands. And then, of course, the other thing is that you have the responsibility then of having that material there when the contractors show up to do the work. I've had a couple of cases where I have to get involved in a situation where a contractor is a little bit sideways because they were providing only the labor, and for whatever reason, we weren't able to get the materials there on a timely basis, and they had people sitting around waiting on it. And that, of course, is not fair to them. That's not the way that it should work. So if you intend to bid materials in a situation like this, even roofing, if you, again, are willing to take on the responsibility of doing that, it's not out of the question that you could bid for the roofing materials, the shingles and the vents and so forth, and get bids for only the tear-off and the labor. So any package that's created for the contracting of a service will include some form of a work scope and some form of a specification. Every job that you do is going to have both of those in one form or another. Now, in both cases, it's important to remember two key things. Number one, most importantly, the information must be accurate. Number two, of less importance, but still important, your information should be thorough. Now, the point that I want to make here, as I say on this slide, it is better to be silent about a detail than to give information that is inaccurate. And that may seem contradictory to what you would otherwise think or hear, but if you give specifications that contain inaccuracies, that means the subcontractor has to look at it and decide what to pay attention to and what to ignore. And once that happens, the specification is virtually worthless. Because if you go into an arbitrary situation, and the bottom line of this whole thing is that you are creating a paper trail. You are creating a basis for backing up what it is that you need. And if you do not get whatever that is that you need, that same basis will be your support as you try to negotiate through whatever that solution might be. So if you end up in a situation where you are at odds with the contractor and they're not going to do what you want them to do, and you have to say, oh yes you are and here's why, if the support that you have for your here's why contains all kinds of things that are inaccurate and that you never meant them to be done anyway, but you want to only concentrate on the part of the specification that is accurate, in the water. That's not going to work. So that's why it's better to not have anything said at all than to say something that is inaccurate or contradictory. The most common contradiction that I see is that a work scope and or specification will say this includes labor and material in one document, and then somewhere else it will say the paint will be provided by the owner. Right off the bat, that leaves some kind of interpretation that either has to be worked out verbally or the contractor has to make their call one way or the other. That can't happen. So having accurate information is vital to this process. Without it, we really might as well just be asking for a price and pointing to what we want and say, give me a number. So we'll talk about the work scope a little bit. The work scope is the where and the how many of the job. It is always unique to a particular project. So the work scope would be, if you're going to re-roof, it would be where the buildings, and for the most part, that would be just about enough. Not entirely, but pretty close. So it can be summed up fairly simply, even on the costly jobs like the roof, hypothetical roofs that I just mentioned. Conversely, it can also be extremely detailed for much less expensive projects, and that might be wood repair. These are the two examples that I've given for years that are the opposite ends of the extreme. So a typical re-roofing job on a colonial square carriage house type of property would be roughly, let's say, $22,000 or $23,000 per building. So if you do 3 buildings, now you're talking $66,000. But the work scope can be summed up fairly succinctly. Buildings 1, 2, and 3, or buildings 10, 11, and 12, whatever that might be. The other side of the ledger is wood repair, where you may, instead of spending $66,000, you may be intending to spend $6,000. But the work scope includes individual repairs on countless addresses involving wood trim, the entry trim, the fluted columns, the bases, the sunbursts, the pediments, the returns, the thresholds. All of those things are individual repairs, and each has to be identified. So you could have page after page after page of these identifications of individual repairs, and all of that collectively makes up the work scope. So you see the difference. A $66,000 job with a work scope that can be summed up in one paragraph versus a $6,000 job with a work scope that takes 10 pages to complete. Nonetheless, both of those are able to sum up the job that you want done in that particular instance. A few things to remember about the work scope. Don't assume that it is obvious that something is included. Going back to the re-roof bids, something that has happened a number of times, properties like Woodlake and Woodbridge and Chelsea Village, those buildings, townhouse buildings, have sheds, and those sheds are roofed the same as the buildings are. We have had circumstances where the work scope did not identify the sheds as being included in the project. The MS assumed that they would know that they would be. But you can't make that assumption. It's possible that the sheds were done since the roofs were and they don't need it. So that's the kind of thing that you would never expect the contractor to have to determine themselves whether or not it's included, and you don't want them to have to go back and ask you verbally because there's no record of that verbal conversation. So again, if things get off track down the road, it should be part of the work scope, part of the bid documents that you prepare as part of this process. Be cautious about providing unit quantities or sizes. Unless you make it clear that these are estimates only, you could be accountable if they are wrong, and this, again, has happened. I hate to keep going back to the roofs. It seems rather redundant, but nonetheless, we've had situations where someone says this roof is 65 square, and it was 68. And when that happens, the contractor has a legitimate reason to go back and say, this roof is bigger than you said it was, you owe me for 3 more square. If you say that it is approximately 65 square, but it's up to you, Mr. Contractor, to confirm that, that's perfectly fine. In fact, it's preferable. When I review a package, and when any of the moms review a package, they want to be able to look at that and get a good idea of the unit quantities that are involved so that we can make our own cost estimate for purposes of reasonableness. We aren't necessarily supposed to just say the low bid is fine in every circumstance. We may see some where even the low bid is considerably more than it should be, and then it's our job to try and rectify that situation. It's tough for us to make that determination if we don't have some kind of a unit amount to refer to. But you always have to make sure that it's verbalized that these are estimates only, and it is incumbent upon the contractor to confirm exactly what it is that you are bidding on. Another good example is lawn care. And just as an aside, the MOM office here will be handling a lot of the lawn care bids this coming year, but not in every case. So if you are bidding your lawn care, your specification, or your work scope, I should say, excuse me, would say it is your responsibility, contractor, to determine the limits of this property. You do not say that it is 4 acres or 7 acres or it ends over there by the lake. You make it their responsibility to use their resources and determine exactly how much area is included in that particular project and bid accordingly. And if it's wrong, unfortunately for them, it is their problem and theirs to sort through without coming back and asking for additional money from us. we'll talk about the specification for a little while. The specification is the how-to and the what-to-use portion of the job. It can be common among similar jobs done at different times on the same property or between one property and another. That's really very typical. Specification works for re-roofing Ashton Brook, also works for Ashton Point. So the work scope changes from one job to another, but the work specification, the job specification, or the spec in short, can be common from one property to another or within the same property from one year to another. Most specifications will reference all of the following. The scope. Now this for years has been a bit of a confusion because it can be associated, of course, with the work scope. The scope that is within the specification is simply a broad overview of the job that you are asking proposals on. So it's like the preface. If you read a novel, often the first page is a preface. It just gives you a little backstory and kind of sets the groundwork for the information that is to come. And the scope of the specification is the very same thing. That's often where it will say that materials are included, and if it does, then you need to make sure that everywhere else within the thread of bid documents reads the very same way. Before we go much further in the specifications, I'll unmute you and see if there are any questions.
Expand that.
Just do what?
Expand it. So on the very left, there's a plus sign. Click on that. And then unmute off.
Okay. Do we have any questions so far?
And feel free to write in the chat if you are not at a place where you can speak.
I'm good.
Okay. We'll continue. So mute all. All right. Specifications. Of course, the main purpose of a specification is to give the method of repair or replacement and the materials that are to be used. So referring to our same two examples, for roofing, method of repair would be, first of all, is it a tear-off, or are you going to roof over? Are there special instructions for mansard roofs that may be part of the jobs? Chelsea Village, for example, has mansard roofs, and those shingles require 3 extra nails per shingle. So that would be a function of the specification. The type of valleys that you would use. There are a number of different types of roof valleys, and the specification is going to dictate which method your contractor uses. On the trim, the specification is going to talk about the method of repair. I guess might dictate if it's an entire replacement of a fluted column, or are you going to allow them to make a miter cut 3 feet up and replace only the part that's bad, or something along those lines. And of course the materials used would be what type of shingle. Is it a 25-year, a 30-year? Is it a dimensional shingle? Function of the specification. On the entry trim, what kind of lumber do you want? Is it treated lumber? Is it B-grade pine or birch? That sort of thing. Cleanup requirements. Clearly that's very important. In addition to cleanup, there might also be protection of surrounding surfaces issues to make sure that the specification covers. And of course that's a big one with painting. Cleanup requirements are huge with painting, but sometimes you can make such a mess as you're doing this project that it can't be cleaned up. I know of a couple of properties that have big white spots on the brick because somebody painting the trim above spilled a bucket of paint and or overspray. That's much more likely. Painting fences and they get overspray on the brick and it simply won't come off. So the first thing to do is make sure that you are covering the requirements in terms of protection of surrounding surfaces, and then finishing up with cleanup requirements. Of course, warranties, that's a big issue. How many years of workmanship are you going to ask for? And of course, there's usually more than one type of warranty involved. The materials may have their own warranty, and the workmanship has another. Materials generally will have much longer in terms of the years involved, while workmanship is 1, maybe 2 years. But there should always be language referencing warranties. Of course, safety requirements. That's a huge issue with our company and most these days. Every job that we do, every specification that we have, almost without exception, should have some disclaimer that says the work must be done in compliance with any applicable OSHA or IOSHA regulation. Indiana is regulated by a state agency, so it's IOSHA, but I'm not sure about Ohio and Kentucky. It's either a state or a federal, but in any case, if you indicate that it must be in compliance with an OSHA regulation, then you're pretty much covered. And kind of going along with that, then the state might have particular permitting issues that are safety related, and if that's the case, then those should be addressed as well. Many of our specifications also include insurance requirements. Remember that this should be settled before a contractor is ever asked to bid the job. We have a printed document, and I can forward that to anyone that needs it. I'm not sure if it's available through SharePoint or SinglePoint, whichever one it is, in the standards. But if it's not, then just send me an email and I'll be glad to send you a copy. But it's a nice, neat, tidy one-page document on Glick letterhead that clearly spells out what our insurance requirements are in terms of the minimum limits and also how it's to be prepared. And that's pretty important. The legal names and additional insured need to be on there. For the most part, if it says the Gene Glick Company, we're going to be okay. However, in major losses, and we've had losses that got well into the millions, you don't want any kind of concern of a loophole. And believe it or not, if an insurance certificate is written incorrectly, just a comma in the right or in the wrong place, or the legal name isn't quite right, that could be some bone of contention between the insurers of whoever is involved, and that's not a problem that we want to ever face. So this this example that I can give you takes all of that guesswork away. On rare occasions, it may also have a payment schedule. This isn't done very often, but we do jobs occasionally that are thousands of dollars in the works. And when that's the case, and if this job is going to take all summer, good example might be a property that is going to paint virtually everything that there is on the exterior of the community. So all of the trim, all of the lintels, all of the doors, so on and so forth. Well, that's a job that, when we've done in the past, has often taken all summer for a contractor to do. Well, it isn't too often that a contractor can float that kind of money for an entire season. So when that's the case, they want partial payments. That's something to work out up front. The specification doesn't necessarily have to say you'll be paid every other week or once a month, but it should at least say that if partial payments are necessary, it must be worked out in advance of the execution of the contract. In other words, you don't want this sprung on you at the last minute. You're in with the contractor to sign the contract, and he sits down and he says, by the way, I've got to have some incremental payments. You want to know that up front so that it's part of the approval process when you're getting the bid through the bid package through the chain of command. All right, I want to talk a little bit about what I refer to as a performance specification. And I was talking with an RPM recently about a specification that she showed me for carpet cleaning. And this was just routine vacant carpet cleaning. And that specification read like a instruction guide for a particular type of carpet cleaner. It talked about coming back 2 or 3 times during the year. It explained the difference between a beater bar and a rotating brush, and really was not applicable to the job at all. In some cases, we don't necessarily need to say, here's how you are going to do the job. Instead, you simply say, here is the finished product that I expect. A good, clean carpet with a reasonable expectation of getting stains out without the use of chemicals and cleaning agents that generate an extra charge. So that's called a performance specification. You don't necessarily tell someone, in this case, how to do the job. You just tell them what your expectations of their performance is. So carpet cleaning is one example. Pest control is another. If you are preparing a bid package for pest control, it's not necessarily going to be up to you to say you are going to use XYZ insecticide, because these insecticides differ from one type of pest to another. They change routinely. Things are banned, new things come onto the market, and when that happens, you aren't aware of it. This is a highly technical, highly specialized service, and the layperson can't really begin to accurately dictate how the job is done. What you want is for the roaches to be dead. So you set that as your performance standard, your specification, and then you include the different things that have been mentioned before, and maybe some other things that are applicable to the job, like what kind of notice do you give, how often you expect them to come, is it routine, is it only when called, is it a routine like once a month, once a quarter, so forth. So that would be an example of a performance specification. Indoor environment remediation. This is the type of thing that can be very specialized. And we could be talking about mold, we could be talking about other things, but if someone is using an ozone machine, for example, you are not going to specify what kind of machine, how long it's on, the amperage, the capacity, that type of thing. You are simply going to say, we have an issue with this unit, and we are hiring you to correct that. It's fairly scientific sometimes, and it's often beyond our ability to be very specific about, but we can be very specific about what our expectations are. And again, there's things that go along with it. I'm not saying that it's carte blanche. You just say, I want this done, and that's your specifications. There are still warranty issues. There are safety issues. There are a number of things that you want to address. But as far as how it is done, just as I said at the beginning, the specification is the how to do a job. You will tell a contractor how to do a valley when they're a roofer, but you won't necessarily tell them how to kill a room full of roaches when you have those. Foundation lifting, that's another that we come up with a lot. You won't necessarily say how many piers that you want, or if it's hydraulic or screw type, or so on or so forth. This is a very specialized task, so if you believe that you need a foundation lifted, you are going to get a proposal from a company that specializes in this work, specify where the problem is and what you expect to happen, and most of what happens from there then comes from the particular contractor. Okay, we'll talk about time and material projects. Time and material bids should only be considered when it's impossible to determine all or a significant portion of the work scope. This most often refers to wood repairs that involve replacement of internal framing. Time and material bids should not be used in lieu of a fixed work scope, no matter how time-consuming that process may be. And the reality of it is that a whole lot of our time and material bids are done for that reason only, because the work scope would be so tedious to complete that it's much, much easier to just say, give me a time and material bid. And while I get that, as I've stressed for years in these types of situations, when you have someone working on a time and material basis, or more directly, they are paid X amount of dollars per hour for the work that they do, there is nothing but their own work ethic that compels them to work hard and expediently. Human nature would often dictate that they work slower and more more laborious to the project. If they are only making X amount of dollars for the job, then that takes that whole concern away. So the bottom line reason why you want to avoid this is that it usually costs you more to do a time and material job for the same amount of work than it would if you create a finite work scope and use that to get your bids and follow through on the work that you need. Time and material bids should confirm the hourly rate for each skill level that's involved. What that means, of course, is that if you've got a 18-year-old kid out there who is doing nothing but moving ladders and fetching tools, there is no reason in the world to be paying that person the same amount of money that you are a 40-year-old highly skilled carpenter. So your time and material bid then means that you have to be explicit about the type of labor that you want involved and that you want prices for. How will the materials be calculated? Often that's cost plus 10%. That's also there's a number of problems that can come from this issue alone. First of all, are you going to pay that carpenter $40 an hour, $45, whatever it might be, to go to the lumber yard and pick up the materials that he determines needs to be involved? The other thing is, if he says he used 500 2x4s, how are you going to know that he actually did? The point of this really is that the time and material bids, while they are easy on one end, on the upfront end, you don't have to create this often very detailed work scope. On the back end, it creates all kinds of supervision issues for you if you do it properly. And if you are not doing it properly, then again, that could very easily mean that you are getting much, much less bang for your buck. One other thing that I want to mention, we had a situation sometime back where the MS got a time and material bid, but on that request for quote, he noted that the materials would be charged at invoice plus 10%. Now what he meant was that he wanted the contractor to figure up his cost of labor and his cost of material, and he didn't want the material to cost him any more than 10% markup. But it was still a time and material job. So in other words, what he was doing was saying to the contractor, here's how you are going to calculate your portion, your material portion of the bid. And we can't really do that. If we're asking for time and material bids, then that's time and material bids. And whether they want to charge 5%, 8%, or 10%, that's really their business to determine. And if they're too high and it takes them out of the competitive range, then so be it. The problem with this same situation was that when the contractor read that, what he thought that we meant was that the bid was to be the labor price and then an understanding that the materials would be in addition to, but at 10% of the invoice. And I can actually see why he thought that, because it isn't too often that we say, here's how you're going to bid the material portion of your job. So he does the work, and he ends up invoicing much more than the superintendent, or the maintenance supervisor expected it to be, and that was the reason why. And so now, because of not necessarily inaccurate but somewhat ambiguous language that was part of the bid documents, it resulted in a fairly significant issue on the back end of the job when we were several $1,000s over what the property expected it to be for this particular project. So keep that kind of thing in mind. How will the hours be accounted for? So I already mentioned that the back end of a time and material project is very supervisory intense, and this kind of sums it up. How are you going to account for the hours? Are you going to have a login sheet? They sign in every morning, they sign out for lunch, back in after lunch, again at the end of the day. Are you going to drive around and make sure that people are working and not taking 6 smoke breaks a day? Whatever the case might be. But the only way that you can get a time and material bid that is anywhere close to as productive in terms of the value of the product received is for you to oversee the job with a fair amount of intensity. And of course, to do that takes away from all of the other tasks that don't go away while this is happening, and just really can set you back. So, moral of the story: time and material bids do have their place, but they should be used sparingly and with an understanding of what comes with it when that's the approach that you take.